The Carriage to Bellweather Square. A Victorian Sleep Story. Chapter 1. Carriage number 7. Every night at 11:45 exactly, carriage number 7 left the little railway square and turned its lamps towards the sleeping city. The square was a quiet one. It had a fountain that no longer ran, 4 plane trees that had grown taller than the rooftops, and a row of iron posts worn smooth by 30 years of gloved hands resting upon them while their owners waited for a carriage home. The horse was called Marlowe. He was grey and patient, and old enough to know the route without being asked. The driver was called Elias Finch. He was not a young man. He had driven the night service for nearly 30 years, and in that time he had learned the city the way other men learn a piece of music, which is to say, by feel and by repetition, and without ever quite needing to look at the page. He knew which streets held the rain longest after a shower. He knew which lamplighters were slow on a Tuesday. He knew the corner where the bakers began their work at 4, and the sound their ovens made through a wall, and the particular smell of the flour dust settling in the alley behind them. He wore a long coat that had been mended at both elbows, and a scarf that his wife had knitted for him a very long time ago, and he kept a small tin lantern hooked beside his seat because he liked the way it swung. There was only one peculiar thing about carriage number 7, and it was not the carriage at all. It was one of the places it went. Bellweather Square did not appear on any map. Elias had looked. In his first year he had looked properly, with a borrowed atlas and a candle, running his finger up and down the printed grid of the city until his eyes ached. He had found Bellamy Street and Bellwood Lane, and a bellwether yard that turned out to be a coal merchant near the river. He had never found the square. After a while he stopped looking, the way you stop looking for a word you cannot remember, knowing perfectly well that it will arrive on its own if you leave it alone. And it did arrive every so often, not often, perhaps 6 times a year, perhaps 8. He always knew before a word was spoken exactly which passengers were going there. Chapter 2. The Silver Tickets. Most nights were ordinary nights. Elias carried clerks home with their leather cases balanced on their knees. He carried elderly ladies from the theatre, still humming whatever the orchestra had finished on, their programmes folded small inside their gloves. He carried doctors coming away from late rounds, too tired to talk, watching the gas lamps go by with their hats in their laps. He carried travellers who had come in on the final train and did not yet know which way their own street faced. The rhythm of those nights never changed, and Elias had long since stopped wanting it to. Hoofbeats on wet stone, rain on the carriage roof, the turn of the wheels, a gas lamp passing the window, and then another, each one lifting the inside of the carriage into gold for a moment and letting it go again. And then a quiet street, and then another quiet street, and then the passenger's own door. But occasionally, perhaps 6 times a year, perhaps 8, someone would step up out of the dark and ask, in a perfectly ordinary voice, to be taken to Bellweather Square. They always carried a silver ticket. It was a small thing, about the size of a railway ticket, though it was not paper and it was not quite metal either. It was cool to hold, and it had a faint weight to it, like a coin that has been in a pocket a long while. On one side was a number. On the other side was a name. Elias never had to be told twice. He would nod and settle his hat and click his tongue once for Marlowe, and the horse would already be turning before the passenger had finished sitting down. Because on those nights carriage number 7 took a different route. Elias would leave the familiar streets behind. He would go past the corner where the road bent towards the river, and past the shuttered chemist with the 2 green bottles in the window, and along a lane so narrow that the lamplight came in only from the ends of it. And at the end of that lane there was an old wrought iron gateway. On any other night the gateway led nowhere at all. It stood between 2 blank walls, and behind it there was a strip of weeds and a broken cart and the back of somebody's warehouse. On these nights it led somewhere. Elias never saw the moment it changed. He had tried, in his younger years, to catch it, to keep his eyes open and fixed on the ironwork as the carriage went through. But it was like trying to watch yourself fall asleep. There was the gateway ahead of him, and the sound of the wheels, and the rain, and the swing of the little tin lantern beside his knee. And then there was Bellweather Square. Chapter 3. The streets beyond the gateway. It was not another world. Elias was quite firm about that in his own mind, on the rare occasions when he allowed himself to think about it at all. It was simply a part of London that had been forgotten. The streets were quieter there. Not silent, but quieter, the way a room is quieter when snow has fallen outside without anybody noticing. The gas lamps glowed a little warmer than the ones on the other side of the gateway. Their light was the colour of honey held up to a window, and it did not flicker so much, and it seemed to reach a little further into the doorways than light usually does. And the shops were open. That was the thing that had astonished him most in the beginning. It would be 1 o'clock in the morning, or 2, and the shops of Bellweather Square would be lit and unhurried and entirely awake. There was a watchmaker on the corner who worked with a glass screwed into one eye, repairing clocks whose owners had disappeared decades ago. He kept them all wound. Elias had once passed his window at the turn of the hour, and heard 40 small chimes come out into the street, each one a fraction behind the last, like a flock of birds settling in a tree. There was a bakery 3 doors along that sold bread to railwaymen from stations that had long since closed. They came in with their collars up and their tickets punched, and they leaned on the counter and they talked about junctions and signal boxes that no longer existed, and the baker listened and wrapped their loaves and said good night to each of them by name. There was a tiny hotel with 9 rooms, all of them permanently prepared. The beds were turned down. The lamps were lit low. There were fresh towels folded on every washstand, and a jug of water on every table, and a little bell on the desk in the hall. Elias had asked the woman at the desk about it once, on a night when his passenger had taken a long time to gather herself before going in. "Are you expecting somebody?" he said. "Always," she said. "When do they arrive?" "When they are ready," she said, and she smiled at him in a way that closed the subject very kindly. And above all of it, above the rooftops and the chimney pots and the crooked line of the street, there hung that strange shimmering light. It was hard to describe, and Elias had never tried to describe it to anybody, because there was nobody to describe it to. It looked like stars, if stars drifted downwards. It looked like the last of a firework, long after the noise, when the sparks are so slow and so soft that you can watch a single one all the way to the ground. It moved between the rooftops without ever quite arriving anywhere, and it made no sound at all. And it lit the wet slates from above, so that the whole square seemed to be resting under something gentle. Elias always stopped the carriage in the same place, beside the mounting stone at the north end, and he waited while his passenger went wherever it was they had come to go. He never followed them. It never occurred to him to follow them. And then, when the carriage was empty again, he turned Marlowe around and went back out through the gateway, and the ordinary city closed quietly over the place behind him. 30 years, and he had never once walked a single street of it. Chapter 4. A ticket with no passenger. It was raining on the night that it happened, which Elias always thought afterwards was the correct weather for it. Not heavy rain. The soft, steady, patient sort that arrives at about 9 in the evening and simply stays, darkening the stone and doubling every lamp in the puddles, and making the whole city smell of iron and wet wool. He had finished his round. He had taken a violinist home to a street near the park, and 2 sisters to a boarding house, and a young man with a hat box who had given him rather too much money and had not waited for the change. He had brought the carriage back to the railway square. Marlowe was steaming gently in the cold, and had begun that slow shifting of weight from one hoof to the other that meant he was thinking about his stable. And Elias, doing what he had done at the end of every night for 30 years, opened the carriage door to check that nothing had been left behind. There, on the seat, exactly in the middle, lay a silver ticket. He stood in the rain and looked at it for some time before he picked it up. There had been no passenger, not that night, not one who had asked for the square, not one who had carried anything of the kind. He went back over the evening in his mind carefully, the way he counted the fares, and he was certain. The ticket was cool in his palm. It had the small familiar weight of all the others. On one side there was a number, 7. He turned it over and held it under the carriage lamp so that the light fell across it, and read what was written there. Elias Finch, Bellweather Square. One final journey. The rain went on falling, and the lamp went on hissing quietly above his head, and Marlowe shook his mane and waited. Now it must be said that another man might have found those 3 lines rather ominous. Another man might have stood there in the dark, with his heart going too quickly, and thought about all the things that a final journey has sometimes been made to mean. Elias did not. He was, if anything, delighted. He had spent 30 years driving other people through that gateway. He had waited by the mounting stone in all weathers, while strangers went into shops he had never entered, and knocked on doors he had never seen open. He had watched that soft, drifting light come down between the rooftops, and had never once stood underneath it with his hat off. He had never been invited. He read the ticket a second time, and then he put it carefully into the inside pocket of his coat, and he patted the pocket flat, and he said, to nobody in particular, "Well, about time." Then he got up onto the seat, and he took the reins, and he turned carriage number 7 towards the river. Chapter 5. The road he had never taken. The city was very quiet. Hoofbeats on wet stone, rain on the carriage roof, the turn of the wheels, a gas lamp passing, and another, and another. They went past the corner where the road bent towards the river. They went past the shuttered chemist with the 2 green bottles in the window, which held the lamplight like 2 small pieces of the sea. They went along the narrow lane where the light came in only from the ends of it, and the sound of the wheels changed, the way it always did there, closing in and becoming rounder between the walls, and ahead of them stood the old wrought-iron gateway. Elias did not try to watch it this time. He had learned that lesson long ago. He let his eyes rest on the wet road just in front of Marlowe's feet, and he let the swing of the little tin lantern move at the edge of his sight, and he let the carriage go through the way it had always gone through, which is to say, easily, and without any fuss at all. The rain stopped. It did not taper off, It simply was not there any longer, and the road ahead was dry and pale, and the air had that settled warmth that a room has when a fire has been burning in it all evening. Elias drew Marlowe to a halt beside the mounting stone at the north end of Bellweather Square, exactly where he always stopped. Then he sat for a moment with the reins slack in his hands. There was no passenger to wait for. He climbed down. His boots made a small sound on the stone that he had heard perhaps 200 times before and had never once thought about, because it had always been the sound of arriving somewhere on somebody else's behalf. He looped the reins loosely and rubbed Marlowe's nose, and Marlowe leaned into it and let out a long breath and settled entirely unbothered, the way horses do in places where nothing is going to happen to them. Elias took off his hat. Above him, between the rooftops, the light was drifting down, slow and pale and soundless. It came in no particular order, and it settled on nothing. He held out one hand, palm up, without really deciding to, and a piece of it passed straight through his fingers and went on going, unhurried, towards the ground. He stood there for a while. Then he put his hat back on, and he walked out into the square. Chapter 6. Small lit windows. The first place he came to was a cafe. It stood on the eastern side, with 3 tables in the window and a brass rail along the front of the counter, and a hand-lettered card propped up beside the till advertising a breakfast at 4pence. Elias stopped in the doorway. He knew the room. He knew the pattern of the tiles on the floor, which was black and white and went diagonally, and he knew the 3rd table from the door, which had always wobbled, and he knew exactly what it smelled like at 7 in the morning, with the door propped open and the street going past outside. He had eaten breakfast there with his father once a week, for the whole of one long winter, when he was 17 and had just started work, and his father had wanted an excuse to see him. The cafe had been pulled down when Elias was 30. There was a bank there now, or there had been a bank, and then something else after the bank. He went in and sat at the 3rd table from the door, the wobbling one, and put both hands flat on the cloth, and stayed there a good long while without saying anything at all. Nobody came to serve him, and nobody needed to. When he came out, the light was still drifting down between the rooftops, and it had put a soft gleam along the wet edge of the pavement, and the square was as quiet as it had been. The second place was a music shop. It was narrow and rather cluttered, and there was a gramophone in the window, with its great brass horn turned out towards the street, like a flower leaning at the light. His wife had bought their first record in that shop. She had spent 11pence on it, which had been a genuinely reckless sum at the time, and she had carried it home held against her chest with both arms, and she had told him in the doorway, before her coat was even off, that she did not regret it in the slightest. She had been right not to. They had played it until it hissed. Elias stood at the window of the music shop for some minutes with his hands behind his back. Inside, on the counter, a record lay out of its sleeve, waiting, as though somebody had been about to put it on and had been called away for a moment. He did not go in. Some things are better kept just on the other side of the glass, and he was old enough to know which ones. The 3rd place was a stable. It was down a short turning at the western corner, and the door was open, and a lamp was burning inside on a bracket, low and yellow. And in the stable, cleaned and oiled and standing quite still, was the carriage he had driven when he first began. It was smaller than he remembered. They always are. The paint was the old dark green that the company had used before the change, and the step was worn through to bright metal on the left side, because he had always got down on the left, and the lamp on the near corner had a crack across the glass that he had meant to have seen to in 1871. Elias walked all the way around it twice. Then he put his hand on the step and he laughed quietly, once, at something that he did not entirely explain to himself. Chapter 7. The Carriage Maker. There was a man sitting on a bench at the back of the stable. He was extremely old. He had a leather apron across his knees and a pipe that was not lit, and he had clearly been sitting there for some time, in the way of somebody who is not waiting so much as simply present. "You found it, then?" he said. "I did," said Elias. "Took you long enough?" "I was never asked." "No," the old man agreed. "That is generally how it works." Elias came and sat down on the bench beside him, because it seemed to be there for that purpose, and for a while the two of them looked at the old green carriage together in the lamplight. "I have brought people here for 30 years, Elias said eventually. "I have never understood what this place is." The old man turned the unlit pipe over in his fingers. "It is not complicated," he said. "The city forgets things. It cannot help it. It is a great deal too busy. So the things it forgets come here, and they are kept." "Kept for what?" "Not for living in," said the old man rather firmly. "That is the part people get wrong, and it is why we do not hand out many tickets. Nobody is meant to stay. It is only so that once in a while a person can come back and look at something properly, instead of half remembering it in a doorway on a wet afternoon and then getting on with their day." He nodded towards the carriage. "You look at it. You have it. Then you go home." Elias thought about the cafe and the third table from the door, and the record lying out of its sleeve on the counter of the music shop. "That seems fair," he said. "It is the fairest thing there is," said the old man. Then he put the pipe in his pocket and he stood up slowly, and he said the thing that Elias had already half worked out for himself somewhere between the cafe and the stable, without ever letting the thought come all the way to the front. "Your carriage is being retired in the morning." Elias nodded. He had known it was coming. Everybody had known. The company had put motor cabs on the early routes in the spring, and then on the afternoon routes, and the night service was the last of it. There had been a notice on the board at the depot for a fortnight. He had read it every evening on his way in, and had not once mentioned it to anybody. "Number 7 goes to the yard tomorrow," the old man said. "Marlowe goes out to grass, which he will enjoy enormously and will pretend not to. And you go home." "Yes." "So the square has made you a route." Elias looked up. "A route?" "One final journey," said the carriage maker. "It is written on the ticket. We are not in the habit of writing things we do not mean." Chapter 8. One Final Route. And so Elias Finch drove carriage number 7 through the streets of Bellweather Square until nearly dawn. There was no passenger, there was no fare, there was nowhere in particular that he had to be by any particular hour, and this, he found, was an entirely new sensation, and it took him most of the first street to get used to it. He went slowly. Hoofbeats on dry stone, which is a rounder and softer sound than hoofbeats on wet. The turn of the wheels, a warm gas lamp passing, and another, each one lifting the inside of the empty carriage into gold for a moment and letting it go again. He drove past the watchmaker, who looked up from his glass and raised one hand without stopping his work. He drove past the bakery, where 3 railway men were leaning on the counter, and one of them stepped out into the street with his loaf under his arm and watched the carriage go by with an expression that Elias recognized, because he had worn it himself many times, watching a train leave a platform he had once worked on. He drove past the little hotel with its 9 prepared rooms and its lamps turned low, and the woman at the desk came to the door and lifted her hand to him. He drove past the cafe and did not stop and did not need to. He went up streets he had never turned into. He found a small green with a bandstand on it and went all the way around the green twice for no reason whatsoever. He found a bridge over a canal that he was almost certain had been filled in before he was born, and he stopped on the top of it and looked down at the black water and the reflected lamps for a good 10 minutes. And all the while the light came drifting down between the rooftops, slow and pale and soundless, settling on the slates and on the road and on the roof of the carriage and on the grey back of the horse. Elias did not hurry any of it. At some point, quite late, he found himself talking. Not about anything. He told Marlowe about the crack in the lamp glass of the old green carriage, and about the 4-penny breakfast, and about a passenger in 1884 who had left an entire cello behind and had never come to claim it. Marlowe, who had heard all of this before and was extremely fond of him, went on walking. The light began eventually to change. It did not get brighter exactly. The drifting sparks simply grew fainter against the sky in the way that a candle grows fainter without anybody touching it. And the shop fronts, one by one, turned their lamps down, and the square settled into the particular grey that comes before a morning. Elias turned the carriage towards the gateway. He did not look back, because he did not want the last of it to be over his shoulder. He wanted it to be where it had always been, ahead of him and behind the walls, in a part of the city that did not need him to keep an eye on it. The wheels changed their sound. The rain came back, soft and steady and patient, and Bellweather Square closed quietly behind him. Chapter 9. The hour before dawn. The ordinary city was very beautiful at that hour, which is something Elias had always known and had never expected anybody to agree with. The streets were washed and empty. The lamps were still lit, but had lost their argument with the sky. Somewhere off to the east, a milk cart was going about its business, and the sound of it came around 2 corners before it arrived. Elias took the long way to the depot. He brought carriage No. 7 in through the arch at 10 minutes past 5, and he unhitched Marlowe, and he rubbed him down properly, taking his time over it, and he gave him rather more than his usual measure, and did not write it in the book. Then he swept out the carriage, he wiped down the seats, he polished both lamps, including the near one, which did not really need it. He stood for a moment with his hand flat on the door. Then he went home, and slept until the middle of the afternoon, which he had not done in 30 years. When the stable manager arrived at 7 that morning, he found the carriage clean and the horse content, and everything squared away in a manner that struck him as unusually thorough even for Finch. And hanging from the near carriage lamp, tied on with a short length of dark thread, he found a small silver number 7. He turned it over in his fingers. It was cool to hold, and it had a faint weight to it, like a coin that has been in a pocket a long while. There was nothing at all on the other side. He could not think what it was for, so he put it aside on the shelf in the office. And then later, being a decent man, he gave it to Elias. Elias thanked him, and did not explain. He kept it beside his bed for the rest of his life, on the little table with the lamp and the water glass, where he could see it last thing at night. And sometimes, in the years afterwards, when the rain had settled in for the evening and the streets outside had gone quiet, he would lie there and listen and hear it all again. Hoofbeats on wet stone, rain on the carriage roof, the turn of the wheels, a gas lamp passing the window, and then another, and then a quiet street, and then another quiet street, and then sleep.